these so-called fringe groups than you are about those who remain silent. Martin Luther King Jr. used to say that the hottest places in hell are reserved for the bystanders to injustice. Are you more concerned about those who might stand idly by and watch it hit the fan than you are those who would actually put things in the fan?
Oh, I am more concerned by far with the people in this society who pretend no injustice really continues, no racism exists anymore, and that there's no role to be played by government or heads of corporations and so forth. Because as long as America is in denial, we can't come to grips with this problem. And you don't even get a decent discussion of the issues at hand because we're like ships passing in the night. If you get a discussion of affirmative action going, most often the people aren't even talking about the same thing. You've got a white guy talking about his conception of some unqualified black getting some good job that he ought to have. And you've got a black person who says, I'm qualified and I want an opportunity which I've never had, and I want my child to have an opportunity. And the argument waxes hot. But they aren't talking about the real world. And all of these things really bother me. And I have found recently, when we had this scandal erupt at Texaco, and you say, how do you face this and still tend to believe that there's no real problem? I have found that people can rationalize their way out of that even.
In what route? What route do they use? By saying it's an isolated incident and it's not typical of American, corporate America?
Yes, I say, look, this is institutionalized. It's in most every corporation in the land. And then I found them getting angry, saying, "Oh, you can't prove that it's institutionalized. Where else could this possibly have happened?" And if you say, "Well, I know a few corporations where this could have happened, and certainly does happen," they just don't want to believe it.
Do you see this in the profession that you practice in journalism?
Oh, very much so.
And could you give, not a personal, by naming names, but just give a for instance as to how you see it practiced? Is it an editorial practice that you see racism manifested?
Well, there's still a great shortage, for example, of blacks who are news directors at any TV station. That is, the person who decides what gets covered in that particular town. The person who decides what's the ratio of crime stories that make the 11 p.m. news as against other kinds of stories. And one of the things we need is to have more minorities, more women in those kinds of roles. Or you take talk shows. I mean, the ones, though, with the biggest audiences making the most money sure don't tend to be minorities. And when people say to me, well, Rowan, you've deplored Bob Grant and G. Gordon Liddy and Rush Limbaugh. What do you want the government to do to them? I said, I don't want the government to do anything to them. I'm absolutely against censorship. Let them have their shows. But I only ask Infinity and the other broadcasting companies to spread out this opportunity to be on the airwaves, to express views, and let blacks come in with a different view of what welfare means and so forth.
Well, how would you handle it if some blacks came along and didn't agree with you editorially? Would that satisfy Carl Rowan?
Oh, yes, as long as you have a variety of black viewpoints on. There are blacks in the media whom I don't agree with, not one whit. Ken Hamlin, for example, but he's got a viewpoint that deserves to be heard. And I wouldn't censor him any more than anybody else.
How would you describe your posture? This is an age of labels. Is Carl Rowan a conservative journalist? Is he a middle-of-the-road journalist? Is he a leftist journalist? How would you describe yourself?
Well, you know, a black conservative reviewed my book in the Baltimore Sun and called me the poster boy of whining liberals. The Washington Afro-American did an editorial on this book in which they didn't like the fact that I criticized Louis Farrakhan and spoke of me as the conservative Mr. Rowan. Now, some years ago I went to a college to speak, and a kid got up and said, well, Mr. Rowan, how would you describe yourself? Are you a moderate compared with Stokely Carmichael and Rap Brown? I said, well, I noticed that when Richard Nixon came out with his enemies list, Stokely Carmichael wasn't on it, Rap Brown wasn't on it, but Carl Rowan was on it. Now you tell me, what am I? Well, I am, if they ask me in terms of politics, I say I'm an independent non-Republican.
Independent non-Republican.
Yes.
Let's take a break while I ponder that. Okay. Well, Mr. Independent non-Republican journalist, you can't be accused of being a bore. Let me ask you how you function as a journalist, the disciplines that you employ in practicing your craft. You are an equal opportunity attacker when so motivated. But what disciplines do you use in practicing your craft?
Well, I try, first of all, to always have the facts. I try not to be wrong. And one of the things I can say to you with the greatest of pride is that you would have to search long and forever to find a situation where a newspaper has had to run a retraction because I didn't have my facts right. I also try to be fair. And that doesn't matter whether I'm writing about a Republican, Democrat, or whatever. And I would wish on my tombstone somebody would say, he gave everybody a fair shake. Beyond that, I would ask them to put a little subhead there and say, he was never afraid to write or speak the truth.
When you do your research, do you try to get it as close from the horse's mouth as possible?
Oh, absolutely. You know, if I'm going to write about somebody allegedly having done something, I want to talk to that individual and get their side of the story. I mean, for example, when I was writing all those articles about thievery within the NAACP, and how they had to get Chavis and Gibson out of there because they were killing that organization. I called those people. I confronted them with the documents I had, with the American Express credit reports, and so forth. So they would have a chance to tell me why they were buying certain things they ought not to have been buying on NAACP money. That's part of giving everybody a fair shake.
How did you get wind of that story anyway? Did you smell something on your own, or did somebody, as they say, pull your coat?
Well, I knew they were deeply in debt, and I knew, for example, one limousine company tipped me off about a terrible waste of money by some officials hiring limousines to ride through the streets of Washington and Baltimore looking for chicks. That's girls in the old days, yeah. And
I'm not that young.
So, yeah. So I got a telephone call, and a certain person said, meet me at the Howard University Hotel. And roll the back window of your car down. So I drove up at the hotel, and this person came out and threw these documents on my back seat. They were American Express reports of bills the NAACP owed, who spent the money, what they spent them for, and so forth. And I poured through these documents, and then I made efforts to get additional documents so that I was absolutely sure that I knew what I was writing about.
Did you confront the accused?
Yes.
And what was their response?
Oh, their response was that it was nothing, that they had authority to do this. And then I checked the minutes of NAACP board meetings to see if any such authority ever was given. And it was not given. And I was assured by top authorities that it had not been given, and by board members.
Have you ever taken an editorial position that you might have gone on to regret, or felt that it was an incorrect position to take?
I am trying to think if I can remember such an occasion, and I don't believe I can. I've taken some where I got a lot of heat and a lot of criticism. For example, even now, as you know, in this book, I've got a long segment in which I'm critical of Louis Farrakhan and his continuing to wrap what fundamentally is a good message in an anti-Semitic package. And there are a lot of blacks who just don't believe that a black writer ought to criticize black leaders. And they let me know it. But I don't buy into that argument. And therefore, I have to take the medicine, even if it includes death threats, as it has.
Really?
Yes.
You took a pretty strong editorial position when Malcolm X was assassinated. As I recall, you didn't write too kindly of Malcolm X.
Well, now let me...
You recall that?
Yeah, but I wasn't writing at the time. I was the director of the U.S. Information Agency, and what actually happened was that the New China News Agency came out with a story saying that they had murdered the foremost integrationists in the United States. And when the press came to me, I made a public statement that the New China News Agency was wrong, that Malcolm X was not the foremost integrationist in America. In fact, he was a separatist. And what I did was set the record straight, and I also commented about other parts of Malcolm's background. Every word of it a fact. But there were people who construed this as being a personal attack on a dead man.
Well, we're almost out of time for this segment, but let's stretch the time a little bit to set the record straight. What is your assessment of Malcolm?
My assessment of Malcolm X was that when he was a separatist, he was wrong. Because I was not, am not, and never will be a separatist. They can say to me, well, Rowan, here's Beale Street in Memphis, that's yours. I may take it, but they've got to watch me, because I'm out for a piece of Madison Avenue and Wall Street, too. And to that extent, and of course there was a time when Malcolm X was doing things that even he later came to say were wrong.
Do you have anything good to say about it?
Oh, and once he changed his tune, he was a great leader, absolutely inspiring leader.
Changed his tune regarding separatism?
Yes, we did change it there, but when he no longer was involved in anything you could call pimping and the antisocial behavior that he himself admitted he had been involved in. And I guess there were some people who say that after he died you shouldn't mention that. But I was in a position where I was talking about the facts with regard to his death and who possibly killed him.
Okay. On that note, let's take another break. We'll continue with more right after this. You mentioned the USIA. How would you nutshell a description of your function, or what the function of the agency is?
The function of the U.S. Information Agency basically is to tell America's story to the world. whatever that story may be. And
straight down the middle, or?
oh, I would say that you are trying to make America look as good as you can without lying. And you're trying to explain things sometimes that you can't make look good in any way. For example, I was director of USIA at the height of the war in Vietnam. And a group of people from Madison Avenue went in to see Lyndon Johnson. And they said, you're not selling this war right. I mean, you got to sell it like you sell soap. And when Johnson told me what they had said, I said, Mr. President, you'd better hire those fellows, because you've got a guy here who knows that people want soap. They need soap. And therefore, it's easy to sell. But I don't know anybody who wants this war or needs it. And to that extent, it's impossible to sell.
I was in Nigeria in 1971 and had occasion to look at a USIA film. And it really glossed over the race problem in this country.
Well,
skimmed it. Now, I can't hold you responsible for that film.
No.
But I want to take you to task about the whole philosophy of what was going on. And is that a fair way of characterizing the general flow of promotional material, for lack of a better word, that was being disseminated around the world?
Well, I can tell you that when Ed Murrow was there and I succeeded him, we had the same philosophy. We told it, warts and all. And I was in more difficulties with Senators Allen Ellender of Louisiana and Dick Russell and so forth than the American public would ever know, because I refused to put out films and other things that did not tell the full story of what was going on. There were people in the Congress who did not want footage being sent abroad of race rioting and of fighting in Little Rock and in Boston and so forth. We sent it anyhow.
Did?
Yes.
It was very...
And the record is there.
It was very injurious to America's foreign policy.
Well, when you put it in the right context, though. I mean,
well, what context could you put it in that would be comfortable?
Well, you know, well, it's not comfortable, but you put it in the context of saying no progress can occur without some strife. And we want you to know which side the President Lyndon Johnson is on. Or we want you to know what the role of other American institutions are. We want you to know that in this march on Washington, it's not just blacks marching on their government, it's whites doing it too. So with that kind of understanding, the foreigner gets a different kind of view of what the violence is all about. And in those days, we could say this is true because the U.S. Supreme Court has said this. Now, it'd be a little bit more difficult with this kind of Supreme Court, and I wouldn't particularly want the job of explaining Clarence Thomas's role as director of USIA. But that's what we were trying to do.
What is your assessment of Mr. Thomas, Justice Thomas?
Well, my assessment is, you know, I'd really have to psychoanalyze him, and I shouldn't be practicing psychiatry without a license. But he's a man who's got some problems in terms of how he sees himself. I am always troubled by a man who has benefited from affirmative action and then turns against it, as if to say it was good for him and not for other black people. And to see him aligned with the most reactionary member of the court, Scalia, troubles me profoundly. And I don't think it's ever going to change, though, no matter how long he sits on that court.
Have you met the man?
Oh, I met him.
Have you jacked him up on your feelings?
Oh, no, not since he's been on the court. I wouldn't even try. I mean, you know, you just don't jack up a Supreme Court justice and get him to change his opinion.
All right. All right, well, there is a Supreme Court justice that you did take on, and I want to talk to you a little bit about that, but we need to take still another break. Stay with us. Thurgood Marshall, when did you meet the man first?
I met Thurgood Marshall first when he came to Minneapolis to give a speech in, I'd say, 1949-50.
What was your make of him then?
Oh, I thought he was a great man. I was a brand new reporter, and I was just thrilled that I had a chance to write about what he'd said. And then when I decided to do a series of articles on the cases before the Supreme Court that we came to know as Brown versus Board of Education, I went to New York, and not only did he invite me into NAACP offices to talk to him about the cases, but to his house to have dinner, where he made the most incredible beef stew I'd ever known in my life. It had at least a bottle of bourbon in it. And so that was the beginning of a warm relationship, shall we say.
And you've both been in the stew ever since.
That's about right.
Why do you think that history singled him out for greatness? Surely there were a cadre of very talented attorneys at that time of Brown versus Board of Ed. What was it that singled him out? Why did destiny tap him on the shoulder for greatness?
Well, one of the things he had was stamina, physical good health. You had a Charlie Houston who was really brilliant, but was of ill health, and he couldn't endure all the things that Thurgood Marshall had to endure during all of those years. Secondly, Thurgood Marshall had a lot more than legal acumen. I mean, he knew how to get things done. He knew how to talk in the slang of the times to get a point across. I mean, Thurgood Marshall could concoct a story. I said, for example, that I'm not a separatist. Neither was Marshall. And this is how he put it. He said, justice is when everybody can get the same thing at the same time in the same place. I believe that profoundly, and there was hardly a white judge in the world who couldn't understand that when he put it that way. And so he had the great communication skills that simply made him a leader.
On a professional level, do you have any criticisms of him, of his skills?
Not really. There were some people, usually white journalists, who wanted to make something of the fact that he didn't always act like a pompous stuffed shirt. When he'd see Chief Justice Earl Warren, he might say, "Hey, Chiefy, what's coming down, baby?" And some white journalists thought that there was something a little wrong with that, but I didn't. Neither did Earl Warren.
Did you and Justice Marshall ever talk about the deliberate speed clause of the Brown versus Board of Ed decision?
Yes, and it pained him profoundly because he never believed you could do what needed to be done with all deliberate speed.
Well, do you happen to know whether he raised the roof at the time or just in retrospect?
Well, he complained bitterly, but he had a limited ability to raise the roof in front of the Supreme Court. He had to concede that in order to get that unanimous decision, Chief Justice Warren had made a decision only to move so fast. And he thought Warren had achieved an incredible goal in getting every member of that court to vote to outlaw Jim Crow. So he just, he didn't want to incite anybody to go out and burn buildings because the court didn't say do it tomorrow.
In your estimation, why would Justice Thomas be so adamant in rejecting reminders from the likes of Judge Higginbottom, who suggested that he remember his forerunners and try to be a part of a continuum for justice? And the word is that he responded quite adamantly in resenting that kind of admonition.
Well, I don't know if it's simply that Thomas intellectually believes that he's right and believes it with such fervor that he doesn't want anybody telling him how he ought to behave, or if lurking inside Thomas there is some kind of doubts about where he is himself and who he is. I just don't know. That's why I said I can't psychoanalyze the man, but there clearly is something going on in his head that's different from what would go on in my head, in terms of a feeling of obligation and duty to people I know have been oppressed for 300 years.
Okay, time for another break. We'll be right back. In building your thesis that Armageddon is on the way, some might say, yeah, that's real, but when you really look at this country, its problems are old and a lot deeper. You know, I mean, racism and the kind of things that this country has done to people of color is old, and maybe that's what's really coming to the surface. And these things are really just lesser symptoms of a deeper disease.
Well, deeper in the sense that we've gone through a period of political leadership where the American people were told in so many words, be as bad as you want to be, instead of a leadership that asked them to be better than they think they can be. I mean, bigotry became fashionable again in America during those years when Ronald Reagan was railing against welfare queens and telling anecdotes about an alleged white man in the supermarket buying hamburger helper while some big buck, read that black, came in and bought T-bone steaks with food stamps, etc. Thurgood Marshall used to say to me, Carl, nothing matters more in America than the gatekeeper. It's the gatekeeper who decides who gets to come in and eat at the banquet and who stands out in the rain with his face pressed against the window. And the President of the United States is the #1 gatekeeper. And your governor is a gatekeeper. And your college president and your corporation chairman, those are the gatekeepers. And we've had some pretty sad gatekeepers, with the result that now you can get on radio a militia leader saying they'll have the war going in 6 months by assassinating 10 or 12 black leaders. Old problems, yes, but if you remember what happened after Dr. King was assassinated, you know that if they want a race war, they can get it with those kinds of assassinations. And that's why I'm sounding this wake-up call today, because the danger is infinitely greater than it was 2 generations ago.
Do the tensions, the racial tensions that beset this country, have any roots in the global situation?
Yes, in the global situation, in the sense that the economies of all countries have changed. I mean, because of global interconnections and because of the development of high technology, the result is you've got a lot of white guys whose wives have better jobs than they can do. Or they look at this tremendous number of women in the workforce now, many of them with the high-tech jobs that he may think he ought to have. He doesn't want to dump on his wife or his cousin, so he looks for scapegoats, and he says that black guy over there is responsible for this. That Hispanic guy is responsible for this. That black woman is responsible for this. And that is the onset of the kind of paranoia I'm talking about.
Right. How would you differentiate and how would you characterize the differences between the 1963 March on Washington and the Million Man March of last year?
Well, the Million Man March, number one, did not have the kind of output or input, that is, of the broad segment of the American population that was the case in 1963.
I.e.?
Well, for example, that's why a lot of whites went into this scapegoat notion that it was almost unsafe to go downtown on the day of that march, because if 1 million black men were going to be there, there was a potential for 1 million muggings. And I write about this mentality in the book. And therefore, it was important that we try to get the message out in a way that all Americans could understand that there was a deep yearning for justice and a deep desire to do the right things by their families and so forth that brought millions of men there, or hundreds of thousands, and not any desire to have a big fight with Jews and so forth. And that's why I'm saying that I want to keep this message of the legitimate yearnings of black men separate from any fight somebody wants to pick with Jews or any other group.
So that outpouring of black men touched you?
Oh, absolutely. When I look at the legitimate aspirations that were involved there. Now, I had some concerns, and still do,
Namely?
About the extent to which some might be suckered in terms of what happened to their money. And you can ask Chavis today what happened to the money raised in the Million Man March and get an answer none of your business.
We need to take another break. That's our business. We'll be back. It's our last segment, Mr. Rowan. And I guess I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you why you place such importance on the Simpson trial. There are those who feel that much ado was made over something that really was not that important in the overall mix of things here in this country.
Because, number one, the Simpson trial is probably the most divisive court case of my lifetime. But secondly, because the Simpson trial has brought out into the open and in the clear the shortcomings of our criminal justice system. You've got a situation that involves American passions over interracial marriage, a black man and a white woman. You've got the issue of spousal abuse, which is very much on the minds of millions of Americans and not just women. You've got much of white America walking away from the constitutional principle that a man is innocent till proven guilty. You've got Americans giving the lie to their claim of honoring a jury system by abusing that jury in the Simpson case and rejecting its verdict. You've got the question of whether a rich man can get more justice in this society than a poor man because he can buy a dream team of lawyers, whether he's black or white. You have got just an incredible array of hot-button issues in the Simpson trial. And in the chapter in my book about the O.J. Simpson case, I'm trying to have Americans produce a new fidelity to the Constitution and to the jury system, and to say to them, if you aren't willing to do that, you're the biggest damn bunch of phonies that God ever created.
Do you think that public appetites created the enormity of that story, or do you think that the news reports created the appetite for it?
Oh, I think the appetite was there. It's just that we fed it to them via television in doses the public could never get before. I mean,
Should it have been televised?
Yes, and so should the civil trial that's going on now. Because no matter what, the verdict in the civil trial, it will not satisfy the nation or produce tranquility. And I'd much prefer a situation where I don't have to get my view of what happened in the civil trial from Geraldo. I'd like to be able to see for myself and make my own judgments as to whether justice was done. I watched almost all of the criminal trial, and that's why I can sit here and say to you categorically they did not prove that O.J. Simpson committed a double murder. Because I watched the evidence along with the jury. I can't say to you O.J. Simpson is innocent. I can say to you the prosecution did not prove him guilty.
All right.
Yes.
In wrapping up this absorbing discussion, what would you say to the African American community that's heard your thesis? Do you have a prescription?
Yes, I have a prescription, and that is I run a scholarship program because I know that learning has liberated more people than all the armies ever put together by man. A learned man is hard to enslave. So I'm begging black youngsters, minority youngsters, to hit those books, to get that learning, that knowledge that bigots cannot take away.
There are many critics of the educational system as not being broad enough in its perspective of history.
Oh, there's a lot wrong with the educational system. A lot. And I know that it cheats the people who are the poorest and live in the least favorable neighborhoods. I can see that when I look at the children who come up to take the tests in my scholarship program. But I still say to those youngsters, strive to get that learning, and I say to parents, don't be deceived by these people who are talking about taking money for the public schools and handing it out in vouchers for people to go to private schools.
Last question. Give me a yes or a no. Do you believe the CIA was involved in bringing drugs into the United States?
Oh, I am absolutely certain that some of those phony airlines set up by the CIA, the planes left the United States loaded with illicit arms for the Contras and came back from drugs. What I don't know is whether this was being done just by rogue agents of the CIA or whether somebody at the top was winking at the process. But I do not doubt that CIA agents were selling drugs to black Americans in order to get money for the Contras that they couldn't get from the Congress.
On that note, I thank you, Mr. Rowan. Thanks for being with us.